Hello, and welcome to Paint the Past. I'm your host, Amaris. So I've rearranged my previous posting plans a little bit in order to release this particular video on Canada Day, and you'll see why. What I'm painting today is a sextant, but it's not just any old gadget. This one was recovered in 2024 from the wreck of HMS Erebus, which now lies on the floor of the Canadian Arctic Ocean in about 11 meters of water in a place called Wilmot and Crampton Bay in the eastern part of Queen Maud Gulf, Nunavut. It's an extraordinary archaeological object, and while I paint, I want to tell you the story of where it came from, because it's an incredible story. The reference photo I'm using is from the Parks Canada website, and I'll provide a link in the description box as always. So let's start at the beginning. It's 1845. Britain is at the height of its imperial confidence. The Royal Navy is the most powerful in the world. Steam power is changing everything. And there's this idea, this decades-old obsession, that somewhere through the frozen maze of islands in the Canadian Arctic, there is a navigable sea route connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. They called it the Northwest Passage. The idea wasn't new. European explorers had been hunting for it since the 1500s. But by the 1840s, most of the route had been mapped, bit by bit, from either end. There was just one stubborn, uncharted stretch left, about 500 kilometers of Arctic waterway that no European ship had ever sailed through completely. The man behind the 1845 expedition was Sir John Barrow, the second Secretary of the Admiralty, who had spent 40 years pushing for Arctic exploration. He was 82 years old by this time, nearly at the end of his career, and he wanted this done. He had one last shot at glory, and the Northwest Passage was it. Now, the man he chose to lead the expedition was Sir John Franklin, and that choice is worth pausing on. Franklin was 59 years old, a bit portly by contemporary accounts, and had recently been removed as Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land, what we now call Tasmania in Australia, after a political dispute. He was not Barrow's first choice, or his second, or his third. Barrow had approached 5 people before Franklin, but Franklin had something the others didn't, or at least didn't have in the same measure. Fame, persistence, and a wife with an iron will. We'll come back to her later. Franklin was an Arctic veteran. He'd been to the Canadian North before, in 1818, and again in overland expeditions in 1819 to 1822 and 1825 to 1827. That first major overland expedition was itself a disaster. He lost 11 of his 20 men to starvation and exposure, and barely survived himself by boiling his own boots for sustenance. That's where he got the nickname, the man who ate his boots. Yet somehow, that story became heroic rather than cautionary. He came home to a hero's welcome. He was knighted. And now, here he was again, heading north one last time. His second in command and captain of one of the ships was Francis Crozier, an Irishman from County Down who was one of the most experienced polar officers in the Navy. The 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, were remarkable vessels. They were originally built as bomb ships, heavily reinforced to absorb the recoil of mortars, which made them unusually strong for repurposing as icebreakers. Both ships had been to Antarctica just a few years earlier, in 1839 to 1843, under James Clark Ross, and had proved themselves in polar conditions. For the 1845 expedition, they were refitted with everything the Victorian age could offer: iron-reinforced bows, internal steam heating systems, auxiliary steam engines fitted with screw propellers. The engines were actually repurposed from railway locomotives, giving each ship the ability to move through calm water at about 4 knots when there was no wind. Their hulls were strengthened with additional beams and iron plating. The crew quarters were insulated. These were state-of-the-art ships of their time. And the provisions they took were extraordinary. According to the ship's manifests, they carried enough food for 3 years. Roughly 60,000 kilograms of flour, 30,000 kilograms of salt beef and pork, 8,000 tins of preserved meat, vegetables, and soup. There was chocolate, lemon juice to ward off scurvy, wine, spirits, tobacco, and coffee. The ships had libraries totaling nearly 3,000 books, including works by Charles Dickens. There were hand organs for entertainments. There was early photographic equipment. There were scientific instruments for botany, zoology, geology, and, critically, given what they were meant to be doing, navigation. Including among those instruments were sextants. A sextant, for anyone who doesn't know, is a beautiful precision instrument, shaped roughly like the letter A, with a telescopic eyepiece and an arc of calibrated metal at the bottom. You use it to measure the angle between a celestial body, the sun or a star, and the horizon. With that angle and the right tables, you can calculate your latitude. On a voyage through uncharted Arctic waters, where your life depends on knowing where you are, a sextant isn't just a tool, it's a lifeline. On the 19th of May, 1845, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror left Greenhithe in Kent, England, accompanied by a supply ship and the HMS Rowler. They made stops in the Orkney Islands and then sailed across the Atlantic to Greenland, where final preparations were made and the last letters home were written. 5 crew members were discharged as medically unfit and sent back on the supply ship. That left 129 men, 24 officers, and 105 sailors to sail west into Lancaster Sound and whatever was beyond it. They were spotted one last time by European eyes in late July of 1845, when 2 whaling ships encountered them in Baffin Bay, waiting for good ice conditions. The whalers chatted with the officers, and then Erebus and Terror sailed on. No European would ever see them again. So what happened? That question consumed the world for nearly 170 years. We know the broad outlines now, pieced together from later searches, physical evidence, and, crucially, as we'll talk about, from the oral histories of the Inuit people who lived in the region and witnessed what happened. In the winter of 1845 to 1846, the ships wintered safely at Beattie Island, at the southern tip of Devon Island. They set up a shore camp, conducted surveys, and settled in for the Arctic night. 3 men died during that winter: Petty Officer John Torrington, Able Seaman John Hartnell, and Royal Marine Private William Brain, and they were buried on the island. Their graves are still there. In 1984, a forensic anthropologist named Owen Beattie and his team exhumed the bodies and found them extraordinarily well preserved by the permafrost. The analysis revealed troubling levels of lead in the bones, far higher than local Inuit remains from the same period. That lead, researchers concluded, came almost certainly from the 8,000 tins of preserved food. The provisioner who supplied them, a man named Stephen Goldner, had been awarded the contract less than 7 weeks before the departure. He worked frantically to fill the enormous order, and the result was tins with sloppy, thick lead solder on the interior seams. Solder that dripped like candle wax down the inside surfaces and leached directly into the food. The expedition's water distillation system may have also used lead-soldered fittings, so from the very beginning, the men may have been slowly poisoning themselves. But in the summer of 1846, things still seemed to be going well enough. The ships pushed south through Peel Sound, making real progress. Then, in September 1846, the ice closed in around them. They became trapped in Victoria Strait, off the northwest coast of King William Island, and they never sailed again. The winters of 1846 to 1847 and 1847 to 1848 passed in the ice. Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847. We know this from the only written document ever recovered from the expedition, a note found later in a cairn on King William Island. It's called the Victory Point Note, and it was written in the margins of a pre-printed Admiralty form, the kind ships were supposed to leave in cairns along their route. The note was written in 2 parts. The first part, dated May 1847, noted the ship's position and reported that all was well. The second part, added in April 1848, tells a different story. 24 men dead, including Franklin. The ship's still icebound after a year and a half, and the remaining 105 men about to abandon the ships and march south toward the Canadian mainland, toward a river called the Back River. They never made it. Every single person on that expedition perished. Evidence gathered over the following decades, human remains found on King William Island and along the Adelaide Peninsula, Inuit accounts, and later forensic studies, paints a picture of men in desperate condition, starving, weakened by scurvy and likely lead poisoning, frostbitten, their judgment possibly impaired. Some of the skeletal remains bore cut marks consistent with cannibalism. It was one of the most complete and catastrophic losses in the history of polar exploration. At this point, the story gets complicated, and honestly, kind of shameful from a historical perspective. The Inuit people of the central Canadian Arctic, the Netsilik Inuit in particular, whose territory encompassed King William Island and the surrounding coastline, saw what happened to Franklin's men. They encountered the survivors. They watched the ships. They found the bodies. And they passed all of this down through oral tradition, generation after generation, with extraordinary precision. As early as 1854, just 6 years after the ships were abandoned, a Scottish explorer named John Rae, while surveying the Boothia Peninsula for the Hudson's Bay Company, met an Inuk man near Pelly Bay. The man told him of a large party of white men who had died of starvation near the mouth of a great river to the west. Other Inuit confirmed this account and showed Rae objects they had found: silver cutlery engraved with the names of Franklin's officers, a medal, a small plate. Rae sent his report back to Britain, and the reaction was deeply revealing about Victorian attitudes. Rather than embracing this information, which was, after all, exactly what the world had been desperate for, the establishment turned on Rae, because Rae's report included the Inuit accounts of cannibalism, and that was unthinkable. Royal Navy officers could not have done such a thing. Lady Jane Franklin, Sir John Franklin's wife, who had spent years campaigning to find her husband and control the narrative of his legacy, launched a concerted effort to discredit Ray. She enlisted, of all people, Charles Dickens, who wrote 2 lengthy articles arguing that the Inuit were untrustworthy savages whose testimony could not be believed, and that the cannibalism, if it had occurred at all, was likely committed by the Inuit themselves. It was racist, it was incorrect, and it delayed the proper understanding of what happened by decades. The Inuit, in other words, were telling the truth from the very beginning, and they were dismissed. Further searches, particularly one led by naval officer Leopold McClintock in 1859, funded by Lady Franklin herself, found physical corroboration, the Victory Point note, human remains, an abandoned lifeboat containing 2 skeletons. Over the following decades, more expeditions gathered more Inuit testimony, found more skeletal remains, and the picture gradually became clearer. But the full story, the actual locations of the ships, remained unknown. For well over a century, people searched for the ships. The approximate area was known, somewhere near King William Island, but the Arctic is vast, the conditions brutal, and the ice that had trapped Erebus and Terror had long since disappeared, leaving no trace of where they'd sat. By the 20th century, one researcher was paying particular attention to Inuit oral histories. His name was David Woodman, and in the 1990s, he began systematically comparing Inuit accounts with the known geography. Time and again, the oral traditions pointed to the northwest coast of the Adelaide Peninsula, a place the Inuit called Utjulik, as the location of where one of the ships had sunk in relatively shallow water, its masts visible above the surface for a time. Woodman argued that searchers should be looking there, not in Victoria Strait, where the ships were last known to have been. In 2008, Parks Canada launched a new systematic search effort for the wrecks, and they built Inuit knowledge into the program from the start. A central figure in that collaboration was a self-taught Inuit historian from the community of Johaven named Louie Kamookak. Kamookak had spent 30 years collecting oral histories from elders on King William Island, carefully recording the stories of what their ancestors had seen, painstakingly cross-referencing traditional Inuit place names with modern maps, assembling a picture of where the ships had gone and what had happened. He had, as he put it, listened to those stories as absolute truth, and he guided Parks Canada toward where to look. Nearly every summer from 2008 onward, Parks Canada search teams, working alongside the Canadian Coast Guard, the Royal Canadian Navy, the Canadian Ice Service, the Government of Nunavut, and the Arctic Research Foundation, towed side-scan sonar through the waters around King William Island. They were looking to find objects on the seafloor. Progress was slow, the ice was uncooperative, and the area was remote and largely uncharted. In 2014, in a moment of both determination and luck, a small vessel called the Martin Bergman, operated by the Arctic Research Foundation, searched the Utjulik area, the area the Inuit oral traditions had consistently pointed to. And on the 2nd of September 2014, the sonar picked up something on the seafloor. Parks Canada divers went down, and there it was, HMS Erebus, lying in just 11 meters of water, remarkably intact. Its deck planking still visible on the sonar, its hull largely preserved by the cold. Ryan Harris, the lead archaeologist, described it as the most extraordinary shipwreck he had ever dived. On the 1st of October 2014, then Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper announced the find in the House of Commons. One of the greatest maritime mysteries in history had been solved. 2 years later, in September 2016, the other half of the mystery was resolved. A man from Johaven, named Sammy Kogvik, a Canadian Ranger, which is a kind of military reserve unit that operates in Canada's north, mentioned to the research team that he had once seen a large piece of timber sticking up through sea ice several years earlier in a bay of King William Island. He hadn't had a camera with him, and so he hadn't told anyone at the time because he had no proof. But he told the team where he'd seen it, and they searched. And there was HMS Terror, sitting in what is now called Terror Bay, at a greater depth than Erebus and even better preserved, so intact that the panes of glass in the captain's cabin were still in place. Both ships were exactly where the Inuit oral traditions had said they would be. Since the discoveries, Parks Canada's underwater archaeology team has conducted diving expeditions almost every summer, pulling objects from the wrecks with careful, methodical precision. The artifacts recovered are breathtaking in their intimacy. A toothbrush with human hairs still caught in the bristles, a fingerprint preserved in sealing wax, a hairbrush with a satinwood handle, a ceramic jar with prepared mustard stamped on it and actual mustard seeds still inside, a razor, a shaving brush, a medicine vial, a wool-lined patent leather boot, an accordion, a barrel organ that once played music during the long, dark Arctic winters, and navigational instruments, which brings us back to the sextant. Researchers had found sextant-related materials from the Erebus wreck going back to almost the initial dives. Artificial horizon instruments, which were used alongside a sextant when the physical horizon was blocked from view by sea ice, were recovered from the lower deck in the officers' cabins in 2015 and again in 2018. In 2019, a remotely operated vehicle spotted the lower half of a sextant box on the seafloor in the ship's hold, though the sextant itself appeared to be absent, either taken by the crew when they abandoned the ship in 1848 or somewhere else on the wreck waiting to be discovered. Then, in 2024, during a 13-day fieldwork season in late August and early September, with dive teams working from a support barge, came the discovery this painting is based on, a nearly complete sextant, recovered from the lower-ranking officer's cabin area of the Erebus. The 2024 season was particularly poignant because the team was also working against time. Climate-driven storm swells and warmer water temperatures are accelerating the collapse of the Erebus's decking, and parts of the wreck that were intact a few years ago are deteriorating. There's urgency to the work now. Think about what this sextant represents. It was made in England, almost certainly sometime in the early to mid-19th century. It was carried aboard one of the most advanced ships of its age. It sailed across the Atlantic, passed through Lancaster Sound into the Arctic archipelago. For 2 years, some officer used it to try to fix the ship's position, measuring the arc of the sun across the sky, calculating latitudes, trying to understand where on Earth they were. When the crew abandoned the Erebus in April 1848, they left this behind. It sank with the ship. It sat on the bottom of the Arctic Ocean for 176 years. And now it's been brought back to the surface, conserved by specialists in Ottawa, and will eventually be displayed at the Natilik Heritage Center in Johaven, the Inuit community whose oral traditions helped find the ship it came from in the first place. that last detail matters more than it might seem at first. The wrecks of the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror are now a National Historic Site of Canada, the first National Historic Site to be jointly managed by the Inuit and Parks Canada. The artifacts recovered from the wrecks are jointly owned by Parks Canada and the Inuit Heritage Trust. The United Kingdom retains ownership of the first 65 artifacts brought up from the Erebus, reflecting the ship's origins as a Royal Naval vessel. But everything else belongs to Canada and the Inuit together. This isn't just a legal arrangement. It reflects a deeper acknowledgement of something that should never have been in question. This is Inuit land, Inuit sea, and Inuit knowledge. The Netsilik Inuit were here before Franklin arrived. They witnessed what happened. They kept the story alive through their oral traditions for 170 years, with a precision and fidelity that eventually proved, unmistakably, to be more accurate than anything the Victorian-era's search expeditions had managed. Inuit guardians now keep watch over the wreck sites, a role that is both practical, protecting the sites from interference, and deeply meaningful. Louie Kamookak, whose 3 decades of oral history work was so central to finding the Erebus, was made an officer of the Order of Canada and a member of the Order of Nunavut before his death in 2018. He was 58 years old. He spent his life listening to the stories of his elders and taking them seriously, and making sure the world eventually did too. Inuit oral history is very strong, he said after the Erebus was found, not only for searching for Franklin's ships, but also for environment and other issues. He was right. And the ships sitting at the bottom of the Canadian Arctic Ocean, and the sextant sitting now on my desk in paper and watercolor, are the proof. Thanks for joining me today for a bit of Arctic exploration. If you want to dig deeper into the Franklin story, I've left some resources in the description below. The Parks Canada website on the wrecks of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror National Historic Site is outstanding. It's comprehensive, and it gives proper space to the Inuit contributions to the search. And I haven't read it, but if you can find a copy of Frozen in Time by Owen, Beattie, and John Geiger, it's said to be a riveting nonfiction book on the subject. As always, I'd love it if you'd leave your suggestions for paintable artifacts with cool stories in the comment section below the video. If you've enjoyed this episode, I hope you'll join me again in a week for the next one. See you next time!